German atrocities committed against Soviet prisoners of war. During World War II, Nazi Germany engaged in a policy of deliberate maltreatment of Soviet prisoners of war POW in contrast to their treatment of British and American POW. This policy, which amounted to deliberately starving and working to death Soviet POW, was grounded in Nazi racial theory, which depicted Slavs as subhumans Untermenschen. The policy resulted in some 3.3 to 3.5 million deaths. During Operation Barbarossa, the Axis invasion of the Soviet Union, and the subsequent German-Soviet War, millions of Red Army and other Soviet armed forces prisoners of war were taken. Many were executed arbitrarily in the field by the German forces or handed over to the SS to be shot, under the Commissar Order. Most, however, died during the death marches from the front lines or under inhumane conditions in German prisoner of war camps and concentration camps. Death toll. It is estimated that at least 3.3 million Soviet POW died in Nazi custody, out of 5.7 million. This figure represents a total of 57% of all Soviet POW, and it may be contrasted with 8,300 out of 231,000 British and U.S. prisoners, or 3.6%. About 5% of the Soviet prisoners who died were Jews. The most deaths took place between June 1941 and January 1942, when the Germans killed an estimated 2.8 million Soviet POW primarily through deliberate starvation, exposure, and summary execution. 1 million at most had been released, most of whom were so-called volunteers Hilfswillige for often compulsory auxiliary service in the Wehrmacht. 500,000 had fled or were liberated. The remaining 3.3 million had perished as POW. The figure of 3.3 million POW dead is based on German figures and analysis. Data published in Russia presents a different view of their POW dead. Viktor Zemskov estimated Soviet POW deaths at 2.3 million. He published statistics that put Soviet POW losses at 2,471,000. 5,734,000 were captured, 821,000 were released for German military service, 72,000 escaped. Of the 823,000 POWs released for service in the German military forces, 212,400 were killed or missing, 436,600 were returned to the USSR and imprisoned, and 180,000 remained in Western countries after the war. Russian military historian Grigory F. Krivoshev maintained POW and MIA losses of the combat forces were actually 1.783 million. According to Krivoshev, the higher figures of dead includes reservists not on active strength, civilians and military personnel who were captured during the course of the war. By September 1941, the mortality rate among Soviet POW was in the order of 1% per day. According to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum USH, by the winter of 1941, starvation and disease resulted in mass death of unimaginable proportions. This deliberate starvation, despite food being available, led many desperate prisoners to resort to acts of cannibalism, was Nazi policy, and was all in accordance with the hunger plan developed by the Reich Minister of Food Herbert Backe. For the Germans, Soviet POW were expendable. They consumed calories needed by others and, unlike Western POW, were considered to be subhuman. Commissar Order. The Commissar Order German, Kommissarbefehl, was a written order given by the German High Command OKW on 6 June 1941, prior to the beginning of Operation Barbarossa, German invasion of the Soviet Union. It demanded that any Soviet political commissar identified among captured troops be shot immediately. Those prisoners who could be identified as thoroughly Bolshevized or as active representatives of the Bolshevist ideology were also to be executed. General internment system for Soviet prisoners of war. In the summer and autumn of 1941, vast numbers of Soviet prisoners were captured in about a dozen large encirclements. Due to their rapid advance into the Soviet Union and an anticipated quick victory, the Germans did not want to ship these prisoners to Germany. Under the administration of the Wehrmacht, the prisoners were processed, guarded, forced marched, or transported in open rail cars to locations mostly in the occupied Soviet Union, Germany, and occupied Poland. Much like comparable events, such as the Pacific War's Baton Death March in 1942, the treatment of prisoners was brutal, without much in the way of supporting logistics. Soviet prisoners of war were stripped of their supplies and clothing by poorly equipped German troops when the cold weather set in. This resulted in death for the prisoners. Most of the camps for Soviet POW were simply open areas fenced off with barbed wire and watchtowers with no inmate housing. These meager conditions forced the crowded prisoners to live in holes they had dug for themselves, which were exposed to the elements. Beatings and other abuse by the guards were common, and prisoners were malnourished, often consuming only a few hundred kilocalories or less per day. Medical treatment was non-existent, and an International Red Cross offer to help in 1941 was rejected by Hitler. The Soviet government ignored offers of help from the International Red Cross, as well as prisoner exchanges from the Axis forces. Some of the Soviet POW were also experimented on. In one such case, Dr. Heinrich Berning from Hamburg University starved prisoners to death as famine experiments. In another instance, a group of prisoners at Shitomir were shot using dum-dum bullets. Prisoner of war camps. The camps established especially for Soviet POW were called Russenlager, Russian camp. The Allied regulars kept by Germany were usually treated in accordance with the 1929 Geneva Convention on Prisoners of War. Although the Soviet Union was not a signatory, Germany was, and Article 82 of the convention required signatories to treat all captured enemy soldiers as between the belligerents who are parties thereto. Russenlager conditions were often even worse than those commonly experienced by prisoners in regular concentration camps. Such camps included Oflag Roman 4C. Allied officers from Western countries at Colditz Castle were forbidden to share Red Cross packages with starving Soviet prisoners. Oflag Roman 13D. In July 1941, a new compound was set up in Oflag Roman 13 for higher-ranking Soviet military officers captured during Operation Barbarossa. It was closed in April 1942, and the surviving officers, many had died during the winter due to an epidemic, were transferred to other camps. Stalag 324, 28,444 Soviet POW were held at this camp near Grady. Stalag 328, 41,012 Soviet POW were held at this camp near Lwów. Stalag 350/Z, according to a 1944 Soviet report, 43,000 captured Red Army personnel were either killed or died from diseases and starvation at this camp near Riga. The prisoners were used for the construction of Salaspil's concentration camp in October 1941. Stalag 359, an epidemic of dysentery led to the execution of some 6,000 Red Army prisoners between 21–28 September 1941, 3,261 of them on the first day, conducted by the Police Battalion 306 of the Ordnungspolizei. By mid-1942, about 20,000 Soviet POW had perished there from hunger, disease, and executions. The camp was then redesignated as the Poniatowa concentration camp for Jews, the main site of the Operation Harvest Festival massacre in 1943. Stalag IB. Tens of thousands of prisoners died in the camp, the vast majority of them Soviets. Stalag Roman 2B. The construction of the second camp, Lager Ost, started in June 1941 to accommodate the huge numbers of Soviet prisoners taken in Operation Barbarossa. In November 1941, a typhoid fever epidemic broke out in the Lager Ost, which went on until March 1942. A total of 38,000 383 Soviet POW were held Stalag Roman 2b. Stalag Roman 3a mortality rates of Soviet prisoners were extremely high compared to the POW of other nations, including around 2,000–2005 Zulus who died in a typhus outbreak during the winter of 1941–42. While non-Soviet prisoners were buried with military honors in individual graves at the camp cemetery, Soviet dead were buried anonymously in mass graves. Stalag Roman 3c, when Soviet prisoners captured during Operation Barbarossa arrived in July 1941, they were held in separate zones and suffered severe conditions and disease. The majority of these prisoners, up to 12,000, were killed, starved to death, or died from disease. Stalag Roman 4a in June–September 1941, Soviet prisoners from Operation Barbarossa were placed in another camp. Conditions were appalling, and starvation, epidemics, and ill treatment took a heavy toll of lives. The dead Soviet prisoners were buried in mass graves. Stalag Roman 4b in July 1941, about 11,000 Soviet soldiers and some officers arrived. By April 1942, only 3,279 remained. The rest had died from malnutrition and a typhus epidemic caused by the deplorable sanitary conditions. Their bodies were buried in mass graves. After April 1942, more Soviet prisoners arrived and died just as rapidly. At the end of 1942, 10,000 reasonably healthy Soviet prisoners were transferred to work in Belgian coal mines. The rest, suffering from tuberculosis, continued to die at the rate of 1020 per day. Stalag Roman 4H Stalag 304 in 1942, at least 1,000 prisoners were weeded out by the Gestapo and shot. Stalag VA during 1941–1942, many Soviet POW arrived, but they were kept in separate enclosures and received much harsher treatment than the other prisoners. Thousands of them died of malnutrition and disease. Stalag VIC, over 2,000 Soviet prisoners from Operation Barbarossa arrived in the summer of 1941. Conditions were appalling, and starvation, epidemics, and ill treatment took a heavy toll of lives. The dead were buried in mass graves. Stalag VIK Stalag 326, between 40,000 and 60,000 prisoners died, mostly buried in 3 mass graves. A Soviet war cemetery is still in existence, containing about 200 named graves. Stalag Roman 7a during 5 years, about 1,000 prisoners died at the camp, over 800 of them Soviets, mostly officers. At the end of the war, there were still 27 Soviet army generals in the camp who had survived the mistreatment that they, like all Soviet prisoners, had been subjected to. The new prisoners were inspected upon arrival by local Munich Gestapo agents. Some 484 were found to be undesirable and immediately sent to concentration camps and murdered. Stalag Roman 8c, 29,436 prisoners were held at this camp. Conditions were appalling, and starvation, epidemics, and ill treatment took a heavy toll of lives. By early 1942, the survivors had been transferred to other camps. Stalag Roman 8e Stalag Roman 8c/c, the first Soviets arrived in July 1941. A total of 57,545 Soviet POW were held at the camp. Stalag Roman 8f Stalag 318/Stalag 344, 108,471 Soviet POW were held at this camp near Lambsdorff. Stalag XB Stalag Roman 11d Stalag 321 in July 1941, over 10,000 Soviet army officers were imprisoned in a new subcamp of Stalag Roman 11b. Thousands of them died in the winter of 1941–42 as the result of a typhoid fever epidemic. Stalag Roman 11c in July 1941, about 20,000 Soviet prisoners captured during Operation Barbarossa arrived. They were housed in the open while huts were being built. Some 14,000 POW died during the winter of 1941–42. In late 1943, the POW camp was closed, and the entire facility became Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. Weeding out program. Soviet prisoners of war in German concentration and extermination camps. Between 140,000 and 500,000 Soviet prisoners of war died or were executed in Nazi concentration camps. Most of those executed were killed by shooting, but some were gassed. Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration camp. About 15,000 Soviet POW who were brought to Auschwitz-I for work. Only 92 remained alive at the last roll call. About 3,000 more were killed by being shot or gassed immediately after arriving. Out of the first 10,000 brought to work in 1941, 9,000 died in the first 5 months. A group of about 600 Soviet prisoners were gassed in the first Zyklon B experiments on 3 September 1941. In December 1941, a further 900 Soviet POW were murdered by means of gas. In March 1941, the SS chief Heinrich Himmler ordered the construction of a large camp for 100,000 Soviet POW at Birkenau, in close proximity to the main camp. Most of the Soviet prisoners were dead by the time Birkenau was reclassified as the Auschwitz-Roman II concentration camp in March 1942. Buchenwald concentration camp. 8,483 Soviet POW were selected in 1941-1942 by 3 Dresden Gestapo officers and sent to the camp for immediate murder by a gunshot to the back of the neck, the infamous Genixchus, using a purpose-built facility. Chelmno extermination camp. The victims murdered at the Chelmno killing center included several hundred Poles and Soviet POW. Dachau concentration camp. Over 4,000 Soviet POW were executed by a firing squad at Hebertshausen shooting range near Dachau. As of June 2020, only 816 names of those murdered in Dachau are known to public. Flossenburg concentration camp. More than 1,000 Soviet POW had been executed in Flossenburg by the end of 1941. Executions continued sporadically up to 1944. The POW at one of the subcamps staged a failed uprising and mass escape attempt on 1 May 1944. The SS also established a special camp for 2,000 Soviet POW within Flossenburg itself. Gross-Rosen concentration camp. 65,000 Soviet POW were killed by feeding them only a thin soup of grass, water, and salt for 6 months. In October 1940, the SS transferred about 3,000 Soviet POW to Gross-Rosen for execution by shooting. Hinzert concentration camp. A group of 70 POW were told that they would undergo a medical examination, but instead were injected with potassium cyanide, a deadly poison. Majdanek concentration camp. The first transport directed toward Majdanek consisted of 5,000 Soviet POW arriving in the latter half of 1941. They soon died of starvation and exposure. Executions were also conducted there by the shooting of prisoners in trenches. A total of 86 of the few 127 prisoners still remaining the following year attempted a mass escape on 14 July 1942. 84 successfully rushed a lightly defended section of fence and escaped into the woods and evaded recapture. In retaliation, the 41 Soviet POW who did not participate were summarily executed. Mauthausen-Gusen concentration camp. Following the outbreak of the Soviet-German War, the camps started to receive a large number of Soviet POW. Most of them were kept in huts separated from the rest of the camp. Soviet POW were a major part of the first groups to be gassed in the newly built gas chamber in early 1942. At least 2843 of them were murdered in the camp. According to the USH, so many POW were shot that the local population complained that their water supply had been contaminated. The rivers and streams near the camp ran red with blood. Neuengamme concentration camp. According to the testimony of Wilhelm Bahr, an ex-medical orderly, during the trial against Bruno Tesch, 200 Soviet POW were gassed by prussic acid in 1942. Sachsenhausen concentration camp. Soviet POW were victims of the largest part of the executions that took place. Thousands of them were murdered immediately after arriving at the camp, including 9,090 executed between 31 August and 2 October 1941. Among those who died there was Lieutenant Yakov Dzhigashvili, the elder son of Joseph Stalin, either by suicide or shot. Sobibor extermination camp, Soviet POW of Jewish ethnicity, were among hundreds of thousands people gassed at Sobibor. A group of captive Soviet officers led by Second Lieutenant Alexander Petrovsky organized a successful mass breakout from Sobibor, after which the SS closed and dismantled the camp. Soviet prisoners of war in German slave labor system. In January 1942, Hitler authorized better treatment of Soviet POW because the war had bogged down and German leaders decided to use prisoners for forced labor on a large scale. See forced labor under German rule during World War II. Their number increased from barely 150,000 in 1942 to the peak of 631,000 in the summer of 1944. Many were dispatched to the coal mines between 1 July and 10 November 1943. 27,638 Soviet POW died in the Ruhr area alone, while others were sent to Krupp, Daimler-Benz, or other companies, where they provided labor while often being slowly worked to death. The largest employers of 1944 were mining 160,000, agriculture 138,000, and the metal industry 131,000. No less than 200,000 prisoners died during forced labor. The organization TOT was a civil and military engineering group in Germany eponymously named for its founder Fritz Todt. The organization was responsible for a wide range of engineering projects both in pre-World War II Germany and in Germany itself, and occupied territories from France to the Soviet Union during the war and became notorious for using forced labor. Most of the so-called volunteer Soviet POW workers were consumed by the organization TOT. The period from 1942 until the end of the war had approximately 1.4 million laborers in the service of the organization TOT. Overall, 1% were Germans rejected from military service, and 1.5% were concentration camp prisoners. The rest were prisoners of war and compulsory laborers from occupied countries. All non-Germans were effectively treated as slaves, and many did not survive the work or the war. Repatriation and after the war. Even during the war, servicemen who had escaped from the encirclement and who crossed the front line from among the civilian population after filtration were sent mainly to replenish the rear units, in particular labor armies. These armies built military industrial facilities, in particular the Kuyabyshev aviation plant, etc. To check former Red Army servicemen who were in captivity and surrounded by the enemy, a network of testing and filtration camps was created by the decree of the State Defense Committee of 27 December 1941. In 1942, in addition to the previously existing Yuski Special Camp, 22 more camps were created in the Vologda, Tambov, Ryazan, Kursk, Voronezh, and other regions. In practice, these special camps were military high-security prisons and for prisoners who in the overwhelming majority did not commit any crimes. In 1944, the flow of prisoners of war and repatriated returning to the Soviet Union increased sharply. In the summer of this year, a new system of filtering and screening by the state security authorities of all returnees was developed and then introduced. In the spring and summer of 1945, a large number of repatriates accumulated at check filtration and collection transfer points in Germany and other European countries, several times exceeding the throughput of these points. The Soviet and Russian military historian G. F. Krivoshev indicates the following figures based on the data of the NKVD. Out of 1,836,562 soldiers who returned home from captivity, 233,400 people were convicted in connection with the accusation of cooperation with the enemy. During the war, servicemen released from captivity in most cases, after a short check, were restored to military service. Moreover, enlisted and non-commissioned personnel, mainly in ordinary military units, and officers as a rule, were deprived of their officer ranks, and from them officer assault penalty battalions were formed. In the post-war period, the released officers were sent to the NKVD camps and spare parts of the Red Army Glavaplatform for a more thorough check. After the war, the privates and sergeants released from captivity, who did not serve in the German army or traitorous formations, were divided into two large groups according to age, demobilized and non-demobilized age. In 1945, prisoners of war of the rank and file and non-demobilized ages, in accordance with a special decree of the State Defense Committee of 18 August 1945, were sent to workers' battalions to work in industry and restore facilities destroyed during the war. By the directive of the General Staff of the Armed Forces of the USSR of 12 July 1946, the workers' battalions were disbanded, and the term transferred to permanent cadres of industry was applied to those enrolled in them. They had no right to change jobs and return to their homeland even after their peers were demobilized from the army. In 1956, a massive review of the cases of convicted former prisoners of war took place. At the initiative of Georgy Zhukov, Minister of Justice Konstantin Gorshin and Attorney General Roman Rudenko issued a joint decree of the Central Committee of the CISU and the USSR Council of Ministers on 29 June 1956 on After that, prosecutorial protests began to be introduced against the sentences to Soviet prisoners of war. As a result of consideration of the protests of the military prosecutor's office made in the second half of 1956, the courts terminated cases with full rehabilitation against 253 convicts, and another 13 convicts changed their sentences with retraining. For example, on 11 December 1956, the plenum of the USSR Supreme Court terminated the criminal case against the former prisoner of war P. Akitin for lack of corpus delicti. When the case was reconsidered, it turned out that Akitin, who performed the duties of a cook in a German camp, became the victim of a slander in beating prisoners of war who disturbed the order in the kitchen. Because of this slander, on 16 July 1948, he was sentenced by the tribunal of the Leningrad Military District to 25 years in forced labor. On 20 September 1956, a decree of the Presidium of the USSR Supreme Soviet extended the amnesty decree of 17 September 1955 to former Soviet servicemen convicted of aiding the enemy. For former prisoners of war, the punishment was reduced to actually served, and they were subject to release. The cases of the deceased executed former prisoners of war were not checked. Literature. Otto Reinhard Keller, Rolf Nagel, Jens 2008. Sowjetische Kriegsgefangene in Deutschem Juosum 1941-1945, Zahlen und Dimension in PDF. Vierteljahrschrift für Zeitgeschichte in German. 56.4 557-602. doi 10.1524/VSCG 2008.26. SDU CID 144,568,410. Bloodlands, Europe between Hitler and Stalin by Timothy Snyder. Kein Kameraden die Wehrmacht und die Sowjetischen Kriegsgefangenen 1941-1945 by Christian Straight. The Policies of Genocide, Jews and Soviet Prisoners of War in Nazi Germany by Gerhard Hirschfeld and Wolfgang J. Mobson. Otto Reinhard Keller, Rolf 2019. Sowjetische Kriegsgefangene im System der Konzentrationslager in German. New Academic Press. ISBN 978-3-7003-2107-5.